the space. It is here that God will mold you and make you what you ought to be. God will make this trial a blessing. Just be patient, you will see. Now I'm standing on a mountain, looking back I can see. When I was in the lowest valley, His strong hand was leading me. Oh, it's good to see the sunshine and to taste sweet victory. God has made this trial a blessing. Oh, the grace He gives to me. God will make this trial a blessing, though it sends me to my knees, though my tears flow like a river, yet in Him there's sweet relief. There's no need to get discouraged, there's no need to talk defeat. God will make this trial a blessing, and the whole wide world will see. God will make this trial a blessing, though it sends me to my knees, though my tears flow like a river, yet in Him there's sweet relief. There's no need to get discouraged, there's no need to talk defeat. God will make this trial a blessing, and the whole wide world will see. God will make this trial a blessing. That's the love He has for me. For me.
Message there. God will make the trial a blessing, and we're certainly grateful for that truth, and talked a little bit about that when we talked about forgiveness, trusting God to work it together for good. So I appreciate that confirming truth via song. 2 Corinthians, again, chapter number 10. We're kind of in a series, and I'm going to kind of give us a little bit more of an understanding of where we are in everything. So I want you to use your imaginations for a moment and imagine out west, perhaps in a large section of tract of land that's more remote, that a foreign military power such as China or Russia, probably China would be more likely to do this, get a large tract of land and was secretly underground building a military installation from which they planned to attack and defeat the United States. And you found out about it. Would you be concerned? Well, we all would be concerned. You say, preacher, I think they are doing that. Well, that might be true. They're certainly buying a lot of real estate up. I just hope they're not doing a lot of underground. But anyway, in order for that to occur, there would have to be 4 effective things. Number 1, they'd have to have the right piece of ground. Number 2, they'd have to have building materials. Does that sound familiar? We talked about that last night. They'd have to build something effective. Those building materials would have to build something that could effectively attack and defeat. And number 4, which we dealt with last year, they'd have to have secrecy. Because once their cover was blown, obviously the United States would take them out. So in order to have a stronghold in your life, Satan has to have real estate. We talked about that on Sunday. He has to have building materials. We talked about that last night. Thirdly, he has to build something effective. We're going to talk about that tonight. And fourthly, he has to have secrecy. And we talked about that last year. I suppose you go back and listen to the message. We talked about the power of light and how Satan is in big trouble when we start to get honest about secret sins to the right people. He can no longer use that to keep us in bondage. And I will say in dealing with teenagers and young adults, secrecy is one of the greatest weapons Satan has to keep men and women in bondage. And the moment you get it out in the open to the appropriate people at the appropriate way, then I almost call it 51% of the battle is done. There's still more battle to be done, but darkness seems powerful until you turn on the lights. and then it's not powerful at all. It just flees away. And we talked again about that last year, so I may not deal with that again. But tonight, I want us to deal with the issue of the stronghold itself. Okay, the building materials are the imagination. So back to 2 Corinthians chapter number 10. Let's begin again in verse number 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we're human beings, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Let me just stop for a moment again, remind us of what carnal weapons are. That's what the world uses. You find it in politics, blackmail, intimidation, and all kinds of threats, and that's the way it works in the world. That's fleshly. By the way, that I think I mentioned this yesterday, but a reminder, because it's one of those big things in my heart, that doesn't work in parenting either. Carnal means doesn't work in parenting. The greatest power you have is the power of love. You can intimidate your kids for only so long, and then pretty soon you're not going to be able to intimidate them anymore. And you won't be able to, at that point, have any influence over their life if that's all you've used. There's a much better way, and that's called love. That works a whole lot better. That lasts a lifetime. So anyway, that kind of is an illustration, an application. So the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of, here's our words, strongholds. Casting down imaginations, faulty reasonings, we talked about that yesterday, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. Okay, secondly, this would be the faulty reliances. Okay, the high things that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. So when we hand Satan those wrong thinking, when he brings wrong thinking and we agree with it, I'm worthless, I can't do anything, God can't use me, God doesn't love me. We talked about the fact that many times the biggest issues that Satan uses in our life is we don't biblically understand who we are, and we do not biblically understand who he is. And just understanding who God is and who you are solves a lot of problems if you get biblical in your understanding. And that's why sometimes I tease a congregation and say, tonight I'm going to do something that's going to thrill you. I'm going to give you a message on anthropology. And everybody looks at you like, that sounds pretty boring. Okay, but anyway, that's just the doctrine of man. What do you look like in the sight of God? And I preached a message last year, do you know who you are? Some of you may remember it because it was the shortest message of the revival meeting. I felt people were most excited about that night. Okay, but I'm just teasing with you. Okay, but anyway, so we're going to go here to we got the imaginations that we hand Satan, and he builds something with them. A high thing. Now, we mentioned last night, I want to just revisit this, and then we'll kind of dive into it. A high thing is anything we make more important than knowing God. Now, a reminder, for those that may not have been here last night, knowledge of God is not talking about knowledge about God. It is talking about intimately knowing Him in a relationship. You know, all of us recognize you can know facts. For instance, Donald Trump is in the news a lot. I don't know if you've noticed that. And Joe Biden is in the news a lot. But I don't think any of us knows him. We don't know him. We've never spent time with him. We've never interacted with him. All we get is whatever the news outlet that we're listening to wants us to believe about him. And so that's what we get. And so we don't really know them as people. And I suppose if we know them as people, we'd have a totally different impression. Maybe more positive, maybe more negative. Who knows? We don't know because we don't know them. There's a politician, a former governor of the state of Wisconsin. He was in there for, I think, 8 years. And his name's Scott Walker. And I met Scott Walker once or twice, shook his hand, said something to him. Scott Walker does not know me. I do not know Scott Walker. But my nephew, Daniel, he could text Scott Walker, and Scott Walker would say, hey, Daniel, and they would have a conversation. He could call him up, and the governor would take his call. He doesn't know him well, but he knows him enough that the governor would know who he is, and he's brought singing groups to the governor's mansion, and he's done a lot in the 8 years the governor was in the mansion there and ran the state of Wisconsin. However, as much as my nephew knows Scott Walker, and not extremely well, he does know him, but I guarantee you this, Mrs. Walker knows him better. What do you think? Yeah, why? Because she spent time, she has interaction, and she knows him in a way that probably few people do. Okay, that's the way it is in any relationship. Some of you know each other better than others. Why? Because of time and interaction. We're going to talk about that in a moment. The knowledge of God is that way. It's talking about a relationship with God. You know him because you've spent time with him. You've interacted with him. He's ministered to you. And you've talked to him. And you've counted on him. And you've seen him come through. Have you ever noticed, I've learned this about faith. Faith is kind of an unusual thing. The more times you've tried God and he's come through for you, the more easy it is to trust him. You know what I'm talking about? For instance, I started in youth evangelism in 1984. I had been out personal soul winning, so I had some dealings with the power of the gospel, but had really not done a lot of preaching of the gospel. And I started in 1984 preaching 3 nights a week to unsaved, where the unsaved would definitely outnumber the saved almost every night of the 3 rally nights we had each week. And I will tell you this, it didn't take me long to get an unbelievable confidence in the gospel. The gospel's like dynamite. Can I say the gospel's not even fair? You know what I'm talking about? It's my brother-in-law and my sister were recently over in Papua New Guinea. And they said the natives, I know this is illegal here, but the natives fish with dynamite. They'll light a stick of dynamite, throw it in the ocean, and then they go scoop everything off the top. You know, God, that's not even fair. Okay, that's the gospel. You say, preacher, how can you say that confidently? Because for 40 years I've preached the gospel, and I'm telling you, I've seen it dynamite, kids. Kids who are laughing, mocking, making fun, and all of a sudden they get a sickening look on their face, and you know the gospel's doing its work. Hallelujah. Now, I can tell you, I preach the gospel, and I'm telling you, I have a great confidence that the gospel's going to do its work. However, for the first 16 years of my ministry, we ministered out of a large college, a Christian college that had a lot of means, and as a result, I never had to worry. If I needed a piece of equipment, guess what I did? I wrote a requisition, sent it in, and most of the time they'd say, okay, and they'd buy me the piece of equipment. So I'll be honest with you, as far as running the ministry financially, I never worried. I mean, I just asked the leadership and generally got what I needed. Okay, now, when God led me to become an independent ministry, and I had to get my equipment and, the finances, all had to come from a different place, like come from God. You know what I learned? I had great confidence in God to be able to save sinners and use the gospel. Why? Because I'd seen it over and over again. But I'll be honest with you, it took me a while to get confidence in God as far as meeting the needs of the ministry. I had to try him many times. God, we need this. God, we need you to intervene. God, we need help over here. God, financially, we're in trouble. What do we do? And as you see God provide and intervene in different ways, sometimes scare you half to death before he, have you ever noticed that? God sometimes scares you half to death before he intervenes. I've learned to have confidence in God. If it's his will, he will meet the need. Okay, the point is, for all of us in this room, as we go throughout life, we learn that God will meet our needs. He'll, whatever our needs might be, but we learn that sometimes we get a new area of faith. We get challenged again. And when we get challenged in that new area of faith, guess what? We learn another aspect of who God is. See, I knew him as the powerful God, dynamite God, but then I began to see him as a providing God. You see the point? And so God does that. And so as you get to know God, that's the idea, that becomes the ultimate in your life. Now, the Bible is telling us this, that whenever we put something up here that becomes more important than that relationship with God, that's a high thing. Now, as I mentioned the other night, it's like a coping mechanism. So I don't know about you, there's times in life when we're not fulfilled. There's times in life when we're needing something to meet our need. There's times in life when we need some meaning. So the question is, when those moments occur in your life, where do you go? Where do you go when there's difficulty? Where do you go when there's pain? Where do you go when things aren't going well in your life? And the answer to that question is your high thing. Hopefully your high thing is knowing God. But for many Christians, we live in a world that's very distracting. We get other high things. And those high things become, how do I say it? They become a military installation from which Satan continues to defeat us in that area, and he begins to take ground and get us in other areas as well. So let me first of all talk about high things that in and of themselves are not wrong. There are things that are not sinful in and of themselves, but when they become more important than knowing God, they have just become sinful. Now, I'll be honest with you, I love sports. Of course, Pastor and I talk some sports. I just do. I don't know why. I grew up in Chicago. That's part of the problem. And I got bit with the Chicago Cubs bug in 1969 when the Cubs were 10 games above the second-place New York Mets going in September 1st, and they somehow were able to lose. I don't know how you do that. You say, preacher, how can you be 10 games up September 1 and not make the playoffs? The answer is Chicago Cubs. There is no other answer. That is it. They are really good at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Okay, but anyway, that's and it's one. I'll tell you, I'm a Cubs fan, so I am telling you, there's one real benefit to being a Cubs fan. You learn to cope with disillusionment early in life. Okay, yeah, get your hopes up, then bang, down they go. A 16 was a shock. I'm still not over it. We're going to celebrate that thing for the next 100 years. Okay, because that's how long it'll take to get number 2. Okay, but but the point is, sports aren't wrong in and of themselves, but can they become too important? Sure they can. I remember about 15, 20 years ago, our pastor had a young man get up. He's 6'3", very athletic. And he gave an unusual testimony. He's now a pastor, a thriving church in Michigan. And he got up and he said, you know, God has really been dealing with me. He said, you know, I follow sports. He said, you tell me, I can tell you every score of every sport the day before. And he said, God has really spoken to my heart that I completely give it up. He said, I'm just making public a decision. I'm not watching any more ball games. I'm not going to check the scores. I'm completely giving it up. Now, God doesn't usually ask that of many people, but evidently God knew he couldn't handle it. So the only way was complete eradication. And that's what God did for him. Now, again, for most people, that's not an issue, that we struggle with making it more important than knowing God, but it can be. Now, let's go to technology. How about social media? Do you think social media can become so important for people that they actually spend too much time on it? And the answer is, you better believe it. Here's a wife, young mother. She's got kids in diapers. You know how it is. Husband comes home from work. Kids have dirty diapers. Mom's in the bedroom doing social media. No meal on the thing. House is a wreck. She spent 4 hours on social media while everything else is just caving in. Does that happen in 2024? You better believe it happens. That's a case where something's become a high thing. And there's other issues with social media in the sense that it probably is meeting a need that Jesus needs to meet. Trying to find from other people what only Jesus can give her. And so, yeah, and again, nothing in and of itself wrong with social media. Many of you out here navigate social media with, you know, it doesn't take too much of your time. You use it to keep in touch with family, whatever. I understand. It's in and of itself not wrong, but it sure can become wrong. How about video games? Oh, I love preaching on video games. I was preaching on video games one time, just going after the teenagers on video games. After the service, a person comes up to me and says, Brother VanGelderen, you have got to stop preaching on video games to teenagers, and you have got to start preaching on video games to adults. I'm thinking, video games on adults? You know, can I say this carefully? And I'm not trying to be unkind. If you're a father and you're a husband, you don't have time for video games. I'm telling you, parenting your kids and loving your wife is a full-time job. But people waste a lot of time on video games. By the way, teenagers, learn not to waste a lot of time on video games now. You say, preacher, how do you know I'm spending too much time on video games? I'm going to tell you, this is exactly how you know. We'll use the word addicted because the world uses it. Here's how you know you're addicted to video games. When you're doing video games, when you ought to be doing something else. So, if you're on a school night doing video games at 12 midnight, guess what? You're addicted. You say, preacher, how can you be that dogmatic? Because at 12 midnight on a school night, guess what you ought to be doing, teenagers? And the answer is sleeping. I've done ministry for 40 years, and I can tell you this. I have more kids fall asleep in chapel than I ever had in my entire ministry. And I don't think I'm any more boring than I was 40 years ago. You know what the problem is? You're on technology half the night. Had a young man on my team who was a video game addict, got right with God and got it in proportion in his life. And he walked up to a preacher's kid who was sleeping during church and he said, "Hey, playing video games at 2 a.m., eh?" Kid looked at him like, "How did you know?" "Well, if you've been there, I guess you know." Okay. I'm just telling you, friends, some things in and of themselves, if they're in proportion, God says all things are lawful to me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. If you can't control video games, young people, you have no right doing them. That's what God says. It's that clear. And a lot of time is wasted. And young people get into technology addictions. They bring that into marriage, and that doesn't help. I'm thinking right now of a dear man. I say he's a dear man, but I mean, he married a friend of my wife's, and he was a video game addict. He'd come home from his job at 5, do video games till he went to bed every night. His kids are a disaster. An absolute disaster spiritually to a person, every one of them. And I'm just telling you, that's an extreme example. But that's what high things can do. Things that in and of themselves are not wrong, but they become wrong because they become too important. How about shopping? Is shopping okay? Well, it depends. Yeah, okay. How about this? As I mentioned yesterday, do people shop with money they don't have to buy things they don't need? And the answer is all the time, yeah. And the point is, they say, dear ladies, that you actually, when you go shopping, you get hits of dopamine when you're buying stuff. You know, I think when we men go shopping, we get anti-dopamine. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, it makes us feel awful. Okay, yeah. Except if you're down at the Harley shop. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay, or down there at Cabela's. Okay, you know, how do I say it? Ladies, these men like to shop too. It's just different stores, and their toys are much more expensive. Okay, but you get the idea. Yeah, so sometimes people, they don't find meaning in life, and they're not fulfilled, and so they go out and buy something just to get that hit of dopamine from something new, something they obviously don't need, can't afford. And all I'm trying to say is there are a lot of high things, and people go there on high things because that's where they find their comfort. That's where they find their fulfillment. That's where they find some kind of meaning, or that's where they medicate the pain in some cases. I heard of one young man. He died at age 29 of being overweight. He died at 600 pounds, topped out at 900. Died at 600, 18 years old, hurt his knee, never took a step in his life after that. He was 600 pounds when he was 18 years old. And the reason he ate himself into early grave, his father had an anger problem, would put him in the corner and just yell at him. Wouldn't hit him, but just yell at him. And his mother would let him use food as his escape. Literally took him into it. That's an extreme example, but took him into an early grave. Yeah, even food can be a coping mechanism. And we all understand these are things that are not in and of themselves sinful, but they can become out of balance. Okay, so some of these things are a little close to home because we recognize as Americans we have a lot of things that are wonderful things we have in life, and entertainment and technology and all these things, but they can become problems. Okay, so that's the first aspect, and I know you may not have thought about that, but that is certainly something that has to be addressed. But let's go to the second part. Here it is. Things that are sinful, and they are, no matter what, they are in and of themselves always sinful. Now, unfortunately, these have become big coping mechanisms. And they're things that people run to. Obviously, technology and media has brought us all kinds of new coping mechanisms. Of course, when I was growing up, the big one in 1960s and on, the big issue that a lot of people is not being careful in their media choices. That was in the early days of television. Things were fairly, tame compared to today. But I will tell you that even back then, there were the seeds, weren't they? I remember just a few years ago, I saw a DVD of a movie I remember watching as a kid back on television, and I thought, oh, that was a great movie, and I bought it from one of my daughters, and we sat down on Christmas Day, and I gave it to her as a gift, sat down on Christmas Day. I think we got about 20 minutes in the movie. I thought, man, this movie is awful, and I took it through in the garbage can. And I realized that I was obviously young at the time. I didn't catch all the innuendos, all the nuances. I didn't catch all the filth, and I realized later on as I was like, wow, that was a lot worse than I thought it was. You ever happen to any of you in this room? Yeah, I thought, oh, that was a golden oldie, and then listen to it again thinking, whoa, I missed a whole lot. Man, I was pretty naive back then. Yeah. The point is, that's unfortunately, I think Christianity has become very, how do I say it, dumbed down to sinful activity just by not being careful on media choices. And I'm talking back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s as things began to change. God's people became desensitized to things we really shouldn't have gotten desensitized to. Now we're in a situation where, how do I say it, media has all kinds of garbage and filth. And I'm just saying, friends, I've known families say, well, we watch a movie a week. I'm thinking to myself, I think you'd run out of the ones you could watch. Well, you know what happens if you're not careful? You begin to excuse things, don't you? Excuse language, excuse moral issues, excuse innuendos. And the problem is your kids become more culturally situated and understanding than you really want them than they are. They're more culturally affirmed than they are biblically. And they kind of get culture, but they don't get Bible. So all I'm simply saying is media has not been a friend to us. And I'm not saying everything media is terrible. I recognize that all of us probably have enjoyed different things that have been produced. And I do understand there's some, now Christians are producing some things, but they're not always squeaky clean themselves. Some of those things have issues. But the point I'm making, friend, is if you're not careful, you're not discerning, media can suck you in and you begin to compromise. It seems subtle, but you begin to compromise. And I will tell you, the thing that rescued me was Bible college. Now, my parents were really good parents, but television was fast changing in the 70s, and they let me watch far too much television. I mean, I'm just telling you. I'd start at 7, go to at least 2 hours a night, sometimes 3. And sometimes they'd come and tell me to not watch anymore. But again, it was 70s, and it wasn't horrendous, but I mean, I could tell you. I mean, in my junior year of high school, I think it was Monday night was Gunsmoke. Tuesday night was Hawaii Five-0. Wednesday night was a half an hour of the Bionic Woman. Then I ran to church. Always wondered what happened on that one. Never saw the second half. And Thursday night, it was SWAT and the Streets of San Francisco. Carl Malden. Some of you remember him. Yeah, I did the American Express commercials. Anybody tracking with me? Anybody tracking with me? And on Friday night, nobody wants to admit it. Okay, and on Friday night, it was my favorite, The $6 Million Man. Boy, I'm telling you, boy, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We can make him faster, stronger. Some of you are playing the tune in your head right now. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. You say, well, preacher, that stuff wasn't that bad. Well, compared to today, you're probably right. But I remember God's Holy Spirit convicting me and saying, you shouldn't be watching that. I remember multiple times. In fact, I remember my senior year having to say, okay, God, I'm making a promise to you, I'll never watch that TV program again. And it seems funny to me now, but back then I thought I was going to die. How can I live without that TV program? And one by one, several of those TV programs had to be axed. You might laugh at the reasons why, but I look back and realize I think God had good reason why. Then I went to Bible college, and at my school, they didn't have TVs in the dorms, and you weren't supposed to watch television. So for 4 years, basically, I didn't watch TV, and I kind of cured me and never went back. But media can certainly be something that becomes a high thing. It's where we go when we're just kind of vegging out, or you're not really happy with life, or we want meaning, or we're not fulfilled, and boom, there we go. And obviously, media choices today can go south a lot faster than the 70s. Be inappropriate and grieve the Holy Spirit. And of course, one of the big ones when it comes to media is obviously the inappropriate, the sensual. And our culture, of course, has gone into the tank. It used to be, I remember when I was growing up, there was such a thing as pornography, but it was on paper, and you had to go down to a bad section of town, walk into a quick stop, and of course, I remember as a kid, I didn't even think about it. That was not even a temptation. Now, it was around me. I grew up in Chicago. After I moved from Durango at 6 years old to Chicago, I'd hear about it. But my mother was praying like nobody's business, and I'm thankful for my mother's prayers. She's praying God would keep me away from it. Only one piece I ever saw, and it was so mangled and messed up, it really was nothing. Don't remember anything inappropriate about it. It was so badly mangled. But that was the only piece I ever came across in my entire upbringing. And that was a different day. Now, I know some people have gotten into the journey of looking at filth because of paper pornography. I understand that. But today it's a different day because it's now accessible. As I talked about on Sunday morning to you men, it's accessible now. Just takes a phone. Just takes hitting a couple of buttons or putting something in the browser, and you can access some of the most vile filth the human mind can imagine, scraped off the walls of hell and put on the internet. And you know exactly what I'm talking about today. And this has become a coping mechanism. In Conquer series by Dr. Ted Roberts, some of you are familiar with the Conquer series, that deals with this issue. He talks about the fact that 70%, I may mention this on Sunday to you men, but 70% of men sitting in church on Sunday morning are struggling with sexual addictions, and pornography is the least of their problems. It's just a huge issue today. And it's accessible. And I'm going to say, since there's a lot of young people in the room, I've got to say this. And I think I said it on Sunday, but I need to say it again. I would fear, if I were you, I would fear a pornographic image more than I'd fear a poisonous snake who could kill you with one bite. As I mentioned, I think on Sunday, I grew up in Chicago. I'd rather have somebody come up to me with a loaded pistol and stick it in my face any day than somebody come and put a sensual image in my face. You say, preacher, why? Because that gun can just put me in heaven a little bit early. But that pornographic image can destroy me, my wife, my kids, my grandkids, my ministry, and the list goes on. I'm just telling you, young people, if you ever come across somebody, you come across filth innocently, or somebody brings it across your pathway, I'm begging you to run to somebody who loves you and cares about you and get help. Because I'm telling you, friends, I've never known, I've dealt with literally scores of young men. I've never met a young man who was glad he ever saw it the first time. Every young man I've ever talked to wishes they had never seen it the first time. Because the greatest protection you have from getting in bondage to looking at filth is innocence. And when you lose it, you mark my words, you can't get it back. And by the way, it's not just young men, young ladies. They say 30% of women are struggling with these issues who are sitting in church on Sunday morning, in the average church. This is a huge issue today. And it is one of the biggest strongholds that I believe we're facing in the church today. Dr. Ted Roberts, who does the Conquer series, and I agree with him on this statement, he says, I believe if God's people would get victory over looking at filth, we'd see revival in our churches, and I think he's right. And there are men out here who do not look at what we might call classic pornography, but you're very defeated in your eyes and your mind. We live in, obviously, a very sensual culture. And honestly, it's summertime now, and it's a bigger problem than it is in wintertime. I'm telling you, there is one benefit in living in Wisconsin. You know what it is, don't you? About half the year, people dress modestly. Even the worst of people dress modestly. You know why? You have to. But we all know in the summertime it becomes a different issue. And I don't know about you, it's tragic to me in the United States of America, a culture that used to have biblical modesty has completely lost it. I remember several years ago I was looking at a Reminisce magazine. Some of you are familiar with Reminisce. And there was a huge picture, a black and white picture of a beach. And my first thought was, I'm going to have to look away. But it didn't take me long to realize everybody on the beach was modest. They had swimming outfits that came down to their elbows, and they had bloomers on down to the knees, the ladies did. And everybody was modest. Do you know that Northwestern University in 1902 or 1903, the dean of women got up to the lady students at Northwestern, we're talking Big Ten. Northwestern University got up and she rebuked the young ladies for holding hands with the guys at a Big Ten school. Do you know we used to have biblical morality in this country? And do you know one of the reasons why we did? Because of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is probably one of the most unknown awakenings in revival history. It was 75 years long. Do you know people were born, lived a full life, and died, and never knew a time when there was not revival fires burning somewhere in the United States? That is what shaped Christian culture in this country. It was the revival fires. And it was in the early 1800s all the way to about Civil War. Somewhere in there. And even during the Civil War, there were revivals taking place in the camps. And you can read about it. Stonewall Jackson had a lot of revivals, in Robert E. Lee and their camps, and even in the Union camps, there was revival going on. It was a remarkable time, but that was characteristic of our country at that time. It was just wave after wave after wave. One of the reasons that in the South you have so many churches is because of that. Then we got more churches when carnality came in and churches split. But anyway, you get the idea. Well, not every split was carnal. My dad did a split that I think was spiritual. But anyway, you get the idea. But the point I'm trying to make, friends, is culture has gone down. And as a result, we're living in a day when it's just unthinkable. And a lot of people, media is a problem. You may not be drawn to what we might call classic pornography, but you can be drawn to inappropriate media that is sensual and provocative and inappropriate. It's like R-rated, PG-13 has some of that junk in it. And all I'm just simply saying, the compromises of God's people are killing us. See, a high thing is anything you make more important than spending time with Jesus. You know, if you spend 5 minutes with Jesus and watch a 3-hour movie that, how do I say it, that grieves the Holy Spirit over and over again, pretty good chance you're not going to have a really good kind of working relationship with Jesus. What do you think? So these are high things. Now you say, okay, preacher, I see that. The passage of Scripture. Now what do we do about it? There are other high things we could talk about. I just mentioned, there's sinful things. We could talk about drugs. We could talk about alcohol. We could talk about any addictive behavior. There are a lot of substances people become addicted to. And as a result of that, we could talk about any of those. Those are the things people run to. You know, most people that go to the bottle, friends, many of them aren't saved, but even Christians who go to the bottle obviously make that their coping mechanism. It becomes higher than having a relationship with Jesus Christ. Or they go to abuse of prescription drugs, or go to some of the other, maybe couldn't solve, maybe not the hard drugs, but some of the other ones, but they all become coping mechanisms. Now, what does God say the answer? Well, here's what He says. You got to cast down the imaginations. How do we do that? Remember we said, well, understanding who we are and understanding who God is. You cast down the error with the truth. So how do you cast down high things? Well, this one's not hard at all. You cast down high things by, again, putting Jesus in the place He ought to be. You take the high thing, you bring it down, and you take knowing Jesus, the most important thing in your life. In dealing with these young men who've struggled in this area of addiction to looking at filth, I am telling you, when you're dealing with these young men, they all will tell you, the ones who get in sustained victory, they all tell you the same thing. You cannot have victory in a sustained manner in the moral realm without a vital, real relationship with Jesus Christ. They'll all tell you that. A year ago, I told you about my son-in-law's story, but his journey out and how he became a different man and is a different man today in a remarkable way. But one of the things that really got him back on track is he was down at a wedding in Mexico, and he was standing in a wedding for his friend, and he flew back to the United States, and the government said COVID hit, and the government said, you got to quarantine. And if you know anybody who has ever dealt with besetting sin, you know being alone is one of the worst things you want to do. Because as my son-in-law mentioned, desire and accessibility and isolation. Boy, isolation's a bad one. And he's scared half to death. 2 weeks he knew he was going to have to quarantine. And so he got in his hotel room, which, as soon as the sun would come in his room, which is early in the we're up in Wisconsin, it comes in pretty early, 5-something, you know. And as soon as that sun would come, he'd get up, get dressed. He'd drive down to Lake Michigan, to the shore. And he said he began to spend time with God like he had never spent time with God. Not just an hour, a couple hours, sometimes 3 hours. And here's what he said, I began to have a relationship with God like I had never had in my entire life. I began to meet with God like I had never met with God in my entire life. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of his beginning to pull out and get victory in a way he had not had up to that point. On another measure of victory. Spending time with God, it's the knowledge of God. Spending time getting to know Him. You say, well, preacher, how do you do that? How do you get to know God? Well, there's a couple of things I need to say. Number one, what we are talking about is not sensory. Kind of alluded to this earlier in the week. It's not sensory, it is spiritual. Now, one of the problems we have as Americans is we have been absolutely catered to in the sensory area. You know, I think in my life, it's just crazy what I have seen happen. Probably you, some of you that are older, you see it too. Like for instance, I know it sounds funny, but think about potato chips. You know, when I was a kid, we had one flavor of potato chips. You know what it was? Potato. And then I remember somewhere back there, they came up with two new flavors, barbecue and sour cream and onion. I'm thinking, man, when we came with sour cream and onion, man, you don't even need the dip. It's on the chip. Unbelievable. We thought that was unbelievable. Have you ever been down the potato chip aisle recently? Some of the flavors they come up with. I was walking by a display and it said beer battered onion rings. I'm thinking, boy, it's a sad day in America when a preacher has to have a conviction against buying a certain kind of potato chip. You know what I'm talking about? I'm not buying any beer battered onion rings. I'm not going there. Okay, yeah. Have you seen the one, chicken and waffles? I saw those, chicken and waffle potato chips. That's weird, isn't it? I didn't buy those either. I'm okay with chicken and waffles. I just don't want them on my chip. You know what I'm talking about? But I will say a few years ago, Ruffles came out with cheeseburger Ruffles. Anybody remember cheeseburger Ruffles? I tried those things. You could taste the mustard. You could taste the ketchup. You could taste the burger. I'm telling you, you could taste the pickle. It was uncanny in a potato chip. Yeah, crazy. Yeah, the world we live in has catered to the sensory like nobody's business. Like for candy, let's go to candy. When I was a kid, I used to go down 5 cents, buy wax lips. Anybody buy wax lips? Yeah, okay, you bought wax lips too? Yeah, buck teeth, you know what I'm talking about. And the idea was you wore them around for a while and then you get tired of them, you chew them up, and it was supposed to taste like bubble gum. You know, I will tell you, wax lips did not taste like bubble gum. You know what wax lips tasted like? Wax, that's what they tasted like. Totally devoid of taste. I mean, I wasted so many nickels on that kind of stuff. I'm telling you, as you notice, they're not around anymore unless you're at some retro store. You know, they're gone. Good riddance, I think. Okay, yeah, but I'm telling you, now if you look down at some of these flavors of these bubble gum, I mean, are these sodas or whatever? It's crazy. Just noticed they keep coming up with new sodas, and like coconut Dr. Pepper. Has anybody tried that yet? I haven't tried it. It looked kind of interesting. Where in the world is that coming from? I'm telling you, we just live in a world that caters to the sensory. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is we Christians can begin to think that reality is what we assimilate through the 5 senses. But the Bible says everything you can see is temporary, and everything you can't see is eternal. We're living for the wrong stuff. Everything you're looking at right now is going to be temporary. Even our bodies will be changed and incorruptible. You're not looking at anything that'll be here 1,000,000 years from now. And yet, that's what we live for. God says, no, you need to live for that which you can't see. That's the eternal. And I want you to understand that's the realm of the Spirit. That's why, as I mentioned last night, God is a Spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in the Spirit. You know, friends, that's where you connect with God in spirit and truth. It's a spiritual realm. And all I'm going to just simply say, that when you meet with God, how do I say this? You are connecting with God in the spiritual realm. It's a spiritual reality. My brother came out with that terminology, my older brother, and I like that. Because a spiritual reality is just that. It's a reality and it's spiritual. Sometimes experiences can be deceptive. You can have real experiences, you can have deceptive experiences, but a spiritual reality infers it's real, and it's in the spiritual realm. So it's what I was talking about last night about spending time with God and knowing that He loves you and living that reality. God loves me. This is what we're talking about tonight too. So actually both these ways, the imaginations come down and the high things come down. They come down with basically the same idea. So I want to give you 3 things about how you get to know God. And I want you to get this. It's simple. It's not rocket science, okay? Number 1, I want you to say the way you get to know God, it takes time. It takes time. I'm certainly not trying to be unkind, but 5 minutes a day is better than no minutes a day. But 5 minutes a day with God may not be able to cut it when it comes to developing a relationship with Jesus Christ. You know, think back when your courting days. How do you think it would have gone with your wife that's sitting next to you if during your courting days you came up, okay, honey, I've got 10 minutes scheduled for you. Okay, 10 minutes are over, I'm gone. Now, I think we need to set aside time with God, don't get me wrong. But we set aside time because we're developing a relationship that we can continue throughout the day. But it does take time. And I don't know how to explain this, but I have certainly seen people make decisions, you know what, and I'm not trying to get legalistic, and I think you've got to be very careful not to get legalistic, but sometimes it's helpful to say, you know what, there's a certain amount of time I'm going to spend every day with God. And I've seen people make those decisions, and literally their relationship with God took off. Several years ago, about 17 or 7, maybe 8, our ministry had an emphasis on prayer for a whole year. And our pastor got up on August, we do them August to August, and he announced it, and he presented it, preached on it. And it was go forward on your knees, which is a quote given by Hudson Taylor to Jonathan Goforth when he wrote a letter to the aged missionary, Hudson Taylor, and say, how am I going to reach the anti-foreign province Hunan? And he wrote back that famous line, go forward on your knees. So we took that as our theme, and everybody's excited. And about January, our pastor gathers our staff, and of course, because it's a suburban church and it's got a lot of ministries, there's a decent amount of staff, and there's probably 15 guys in the room. And he gathered the staff and said, how is the emphasis on prayer changing our church? And the answer was, it's not at all. Nobody's doing any more praying than they did 3-4 months ago. I mean, it's one of those moments where I think everybody was kind of like, everybody was starting to admit it. Yeah, it's not changing our department. No, our department's not, it's not, no, I can't, I don't know of anywhere it's changing people. And giftings are different. You may not understand this, but I sometimes tease people and say I'm afflicted with the gift of the evangelist. And sometimes I can get in trouble with that gift. You know what I'm talking about? You just get burdened about stuff, you can't keep it in. And so I said to the staff, these are good men. These are men I've known for years. I have a good relationship with them. But I just said out loud, I said, men, you know what I think the problem is? If the men in this room aren't having victory in prayer, I bet you that's the people under us aren't going to have victory either. Now we have good men on our staff, and they begin to admit, you know what? I'm pretty defeated in prayer. And pretty much everybody in that room admitted, my prayer life is not really that good. And our pastor said, okay, man, I want everybody in this room to get alone with God and choose an amount of time for 2 months that you promise God you're going to spend every day. And then I want you to find another staff member in this room and become accountable. 2 months. That's what I want you to do. That 2 months probably changed. I mean, it changed many of those lives, and it also impacted our church. I have a friend of mine, 20 minutes. He said, 20 minutes, I want to make 20-minute commitment. Now, it's 60 minutes. Has been for years. And he's just transformed his life, spending time with God. Well, that emphasis began to take off, and our missions director came up to our pastor and said, you ever heard of this Dick Eastman, Hour That Changes the World? And handed him a little booklet, Hour That Changes the World. And our pastor read it and sensed like the Holy Spirit, let's try this. And so we got all the extended staff. That was just your pastoral men. And so our extended staff would be more like 50, 60, because that's kitchen and all the things going on. And gathered them together before the second semester and said, I want everybody to turn your cell phone off. I don't want anybody to leave this room. We're going to all spend an hour with God. Many people in that room testified they had never spent an uninterrupted hour with God in their entire lives. That was the first time. Many of them will tell you that that hour changed their life. And he gave them the directions and said, we're all going to spend an hour with God. And they did. And of course, many of them were thrilled. Then he went on a deacon's retreat, said to the deacon board, we're going to spend an hour with God. Turn your cell phones off, we're spending an hour with God. Many of them will testify that hour changed their life. Then on a Sunday night, he said, I'm not preaching tonight. Everybody turn off your cell phones, nobody leave. We are going to all, as a congregation, spend an hour with God. And he taught it to the congregation. All I can tell you is there are people in that room 7, 8 years ago who have spent an hour with God from that day to this. And I just changed their life. Now, don't get hung up on the hour, although Jesus did say, why can't you watch with me 1 hour? What I'm trying to talk about is extended time. That you wrestle with God what he wants you to do. But this is what was the emphasis. And I remember at the end of that school year, I've gone a lot, as you well know, and I was back at the very end. We had a wonderful testimony time and a lot of testimonies about the hour with God. And I noticed it came time we were going to sing our final song, and as we were singing our final song, I noticed there was a student near the back of the auditorium. It was a girl, I think it was a junior. I don't think I'd ever seen her smile in my entire life. She came from a very dysfunctional home. And I noticed while we were singing this song about prayer, it's like she was looking through the roof, like it didn't exist. And she had a glow on her face I'd never seen. It was like she was looking into heaven and tears were coursing down her cheeks. I'm thinking, what happened to her? So later in the day, I saw her, called her name, and I said, what in the world happened to you? Do you know what she did not do? She did not look back at me and say, what are you talking about? She kind of grinned sheepishly. She said, Dr. Jim, that's what they call me there. Dr. Jim, I was miserable. I didn't say it, but you know what I felt like saying? Tell me something I don't know. She said, I was miserable. She said, I'm looking around all these students spending time with God. She said they had something that I knew I did not have. And she said, I made a decision. I'm going to spend an hour with God if it kills me. Well, if you know anything about spending an hour with God when God's not there, it does kill you. For about 3 or 4 days, she just barely got through the hour. She said, you know, I don't know, 4th, 5th, 6th day, 3rd, I can't remember what she said, somewhere in there. She said, I'm having my hour with God. And she had again, I wish I could have taken a video because she had an awe on her face. She said, I'm having my hour with God. Dr. Jim, all of a sudden, he was there. You know, I'm telling you, friends, it takes time. Number 2, it takes a pursuit. It takes a pursuit. And you shall seek for me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. Do you know that God does not play hide and go seek? Did you know that? He says, seek me, and you will find me. But if from thence thou shalt seek the Lord thy God, thou shalt find him. If you seek for him with all your heart and with all your soul, Deuteronomy 4:29. I will pour water on him who is thirsty, Isaiah promises. Isaiah 41:17, when the poor and needy seek water and there is none, and their tongue faileth for thirst, I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. Isn't that a great promise? You know what God's saying? If you seek me, you'll find me. Several years ago, my brother-in-law, or my wife Rhonda's older brother, was in college, same college we were at. And he got a income tax refund check, and he threw it in his empty tennis ball can, put a cap on it, figured that way nobody'd steal it, and kind of hid it in his closet. And several weeks later was white glove, and right before the end of the semester, and he was cleaning things out, felt the empty tennis can bottle, threw it in the trash. He was driving home at the end of the semester, and all of a sudden it hit him. The tennis ball can had a sizable check in it. It's a little different than it is today with all the technology. He knew that money's gone if he can't find that can. He drove back, about 2 hours back, went to I think the campus dump. It may have been the town dump, but I'm pretty sure it was the campus dump. And of course, there were 5,000 students on that campus, so it's not a small dump. And he started looking for that tennis ball can. I have one question for everybody in this room. How long did he look for that tennis ball can? And the answer is, until he found it. I promise you this. If you seek God till you find him, you will find him. If you come with that attitude, God, I can't go without you. I got to have you, God. You're the number one priority. God, if anything happens in my life, I got to find you. I need a relationship with you. He'll show up. He's not a respecter of persons. He's just looking for somebody who wants him, makes him top priority, takes knowing Jesus and makes it more important than any high thing. They all come down. No, Jesus is the most important. This is not hard to get. Time, desire, hunger, thirst, however you want to frame it up. So, well, preacher, what does that look like? Read the book of Psalms. As the heart panteth after the water brook, so my soul panteth after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. Psalm 42. Psalm 63, 1 and 2. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My flesh longeth for thee. My soul thirsteth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory. You get the idea? The psalmist wants God. Psalm 84. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. You know what I encourage all you young people to do? Don't wait till you're in college to seek God. Seek Him now. God will show up to a 15-year-old that wants Him. You know that? God will show up to a 12-year-old that wants Him. Sure He will. He's not a respecter of persons. You don't have to be old to be spiritual. You can meet with God. It just takes time. It just takes desire. But there's one final thing. Number 3, expectation. What would you do if you were out on the streets and if you died right now, where'd you go? I'd go to hell. Would you like to know how to go to heaven? Yeah, I sure would. You give them the gospel. They pray. And then after their prayer, you're all pumped up and say, well, if you died right now, where would you go? Well, I'd go straight to hell. Well, we just went over this. Why do you think you go to hell? Well, I know I prayed and asked Him to wash my sins away and give me eternal life, but I don't think He did. Would you be excited about that salvation decision? I don't think so. You know why? Because that's unbelief. That's not belief. So here's the person, yeah, I'm seeking God. I don't think He'll show up. There's got to be expectation. He said, if you seek me, you'll find me. Again, this is not rocket science. Can I say this? If you can live without God, you will. But if you say, preacher, I can't live without God, you don't have to. Francis Havergal, who wrote the famous hymn, Like a River Glorious, wrote another hymn that's not as well known, I Cannot Live Without Thee. A few years ago, I was at a summer camp. They took the text and put it to a more new tune, and I was stirred by the words, I cannot do without Thee. Can you? I love the third stanza. It gives these words, weakness will be power when leaning hard on Thee. Boy, I thought, man, that's rich. Talked about that a little bit last night. And all I'm telling you, friends, is you don't have to live without God. So tonight, God's saying, how do you bring down? God's trying to help us. As you ask the question, how do I bring down the high things? And the answer is, knowing Jesus. Spend the time with Him. Seeking Him. Takes time, takes desire, and takes expectation. Can I ask every head bowed, please, and every eye closed, heads are bowed?